Hello, welcome to lesson 4.6. It is our last lesson on arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and today we'll talk about their role in soil and ecosystem restoration. We'll look at the possibilities of conservation of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and restoration of ecosystems containing plants that are symbiotic with these fungi, but also in general their role in restoration of ecosystems and soils. And then lastly, we'll look at some recommendations as to what needs to happen in order for us to further understand this very, very ancient and very important symbiosis. So let's get into lesson 4.6. We'll be talking about how we can use arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in plant and ecosystem conservation and restoration, because we know that these arbuscular mycorrhizal plants are better fitted to the environment in terms of their survival, their growth and reproduction. They also have increased plant nutrient uptake and accumulation, and can access nutrients for plants that would otherwise be unavailable. They also increase plant tolerance to adverse conditions such as climate, pollution, salinity, and oftentimes have been shown to provide disease resistance and also improve water relations for the plant community. In terms of plant community structure, they can increase competition with weeds, they increase plant diversity and also speed up succession and play a major role in plant community succession. And of course, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are a great food source for organisms that feed on these fungi. And by feeding plants, these fungi also indirectly feed organisms that feed on the plants. So therefore, that increases animal communities or supports animal communities, and this means that the whole ecosystem is better off by having animals in the ecosystem that are spreading fungal spores, that are disseminating seeds. So it all kind of works together, and we know that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi provide all these incredible benefits to plants. They do have minimal host specificity and are present in most soils. So inoculation of propagated seedlings might be one of the ways that would speed up this symbiotic or support this symbiotic relationship in ecosystem restoration and soil restoration. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi also reduce transplantation mortality of plants. They have been used successfully in sand dune rehabilitation. However, in low nutrient systems such as sand and in desert situations where moisture is not abundant, it is a slow recovery and it takes time to develop this mycorrhizal bank, this arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis. They have also extensively been studied in the remediation of heavy metal contaminated soils, so we know that certain arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are quite tolerant to heavy metals. When there's severe disturbance, as mentioned earlier, there is loss of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that are adapted to local conditions. So we may introduce arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi from elsewhere, but that loss of those adapted species, of adapted communities, has severe consequences. This is why severe soil disturbance is a tragedy, really. It's a very big loss for the ecosystem. Arbuscular mycorrhizal species diversity recovery after fire can be stimulated by planting more arbuscular mycorrhizal understory herbaceous plants. This is where it's quite tricky because normally we burn to actually remove that middle story to prevent fires. And so the only way really to have those arbuscular mycorrhizal communities is to actually have that understory. So herbaceous plants can be used to actually recover the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. But as we know in Australia, we burn that middle layer and oftentimes we want to keep that biomass from not accumulating. So this is probably not something that many Australian land managers would go for. You can also plant colonized plants instead of sowing seeds. Of course, seeds can also be inoculated as well. You can mix propagules with seed and put it out there, but colonized plants will have probably much better chance of starting that symbiosis off and kicking in right away as the plant is photosynthesizing. And this can lead to restoration of invaded areas. And you can read a review. There's a whole review written about how this is possible. Okay, so we know now that there are potentials in using arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in ecosystem conservation and restoration. However, there are so many different questions yet to be answered as to how to actually properly utilize this symbiosis. There's so much still to be discovered about this symbiosis, and there's a lot of knowledge gaps. So some of these include fungal genetics and functional diversity variation between habitats. These are the things that are not known because they're specific to particular habitats, specific situations. Are functional differences between isolates more important than variations in taxonomic distribution of these fungi, as well as the plants? Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are adapted to locality. So when they come from one location, there might be a reduced functional performance at another. So that means moving arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi from one area to another might not be beneficial because they might not even survive because they're not adapted to that environment. Restoration depends on the rapidity of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal adaptation to soil condition changes during succession. So that behavior of the fungi and the plant symbiosis really depends on the soil conditions and how over time succession changes that adaptation. How efficient is the dispersal from remnant vegetation? The dispersal of spores and dispersal of roots that are colonized with mycorrhizal fungi, they grow towards disturbed areas from remnant vegetation. It is great when there's remnant vegetation left because you can extend that forest, but the efficacy of that has to be studied and it's going to be specific for a specific situation. How many species are there in most habitats? That is unknown. We don't even know basic biology, and even the life cycle knowledge is missing or not yet prominently known for each individual species of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. What are the effects of arbuscular mycorrhizal community dynamics on AM contribution to plant productivity and dominance? What is the arbuscular mycorrhizal nutrient uptake in natural ecosystems? Because mostly we study agricultural systems. How do soil and climatic changes impact arbuscular mycorrhizal plant communities? So these are just questions that scientists are asking and need to be asking as to whether conservation is possible and whether restoration of habitats with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi is worth it. The lovely image you can see on the right is from a National Geographic article. It demonstrates the incredible power that there is when trees are actually planted within agricultural systems. South of the Sahara Desert, there's a country called Niger, and farmers have always farmed crops with the trees in the landscape. However, in the early 20th century, they were advised by the colonial French government to actually remove trees because they wanted to exploit the region for peanut export. So farmers were brainwashed into chopping out trees that were always present within the region, and people actually took wood from those trees and they prevented erosion. They were obviously part of the landscape and very necessary for that landscape. So by the 1960s, there was actually famine. Crops weren't doing well, erosion was prolific, people walked for kilometers to find trees for wood so they could cook. Just became a nightmare basically for the country, and they religiously would cut down the stumps that would be continually growing back to get rid of the regrowth because they were told it would compete with their peanuts and other crops. But at some point there was a group of farmers that went away for work during the dry season, and they didn't actually manage to cut the stumps, the regrowth that was growing on the stumps. And they've noticed that where the stumps were actually regenerating, the crops that they were growing around those stumps were actually doing way better than where the trees weren't present. And this sort of reminded them of how they once farmed before the famines, before all this tragedy of desertification and loss of their livelihoods, really. Then there was a man called Tony Ronaldo who is an Australian missionary and an agronomist, and he was actually trying to plant trees, trying to encourage people to plant trees in the region to sort of regreen the desert. But he noticed a stump regrowing as well. He then wanted to really promote this idea of allowing the trees to grow back, whereas before that he was sort of pushing for planting, which was expensive. The trees were failing. So he basically just went on a mission and traveled and tried to convince farmers to just let those tree stumps recover, let the trees grow. And this has transformed that entire country, and it's spread to other parts of Africa as well. And it's really done wonders where the crops have grown well since, and wood has become available for cooking again. And people are now farming these trees, looking after these regrowth trees. It's just an amazing story, and just what a wonderful way that people can live with nature and still produce food while farming in an existing ecosystem that's natural. It's a no-brainer, really. That's how it's been done for centuries and sustained, and it's only with the advent of this mechanized agriculture that was proposed to these farmers back in the early 20th century that this mechanization and this greed for industrialization, for creating an income from agriculture, has led this country and many other countries to destruction, to famine, to complete collapse and ecological collapse as well as agricultural collapse. So this can be reinstated, the natural way of growing food and ecosystems together. And I love this article and the image. It's just a beautiful image because it really represents to me ecosystem restoration. It really does demonstrate power of working with nature. This is just such a great example of what's possible when we go back to our traditional ways of raising food and incorporating nature, incorporating the natural ecosystems into our farmlands. So I thought it was a really lovely, suitable image for this slide. And this is what we need to do if we're going to change this world for a better place, for a brighter tomorrow. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are actually difficult to study. This is another problem that we have with trying to understand this complex system and how to use it to our advantage, or how to conserve it, or how to use it in conservation and restoration of ecosystems. Usually it is performed by population studies, usually via spore isolation, and normally there can be up to 25 species per sample of soil with high taxonomic diversity. So there are lots of different species in soils when spores are counted. Fine textured soils with organic matter, as well as infrequent sporulation and non-uniform distribution, makes it even more difficult to actually even isolate these spores. To study arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and the plant, the arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis, there is a requirement of association with a living plant. So you can't study these organisms in isolation, so that makes it difficult as well. Normally there's a pot trap culture system set up in sandy soils with low phosphate, and also aeroponics and root organ cultures. All of these methods can be used to actually grow the symbiotic relationship and observe it. So to actually study specific species of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the spores have to be isolated from a field soil, and oftentimes there will be several different species in that soil, so it has to be purified over time. So it is very difficult and time-consuming. And then if you want to examine it microscopically, which you want to do in order to quantify the colonization percentage by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi of the specific roots of the plant, you have to go through a pretty full-on procedure, clearing the roots with KOH and then staining that and then identifying those through microscopy. And now there has been some development in trying to help scientists quantify these arbuscular mycorrhizal structures within roots by actually producing an app that can actually count the colonization percentage within an image. Otherwise, it's a very laborious process to gain some perspective of colonization percentage by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi to determine the abundance of a particular species present within the ecosystem or in relationship with a specific plant species. All this really depends on whether the particular species produces spores and when and where, and the seasonality of that, and then also how old the roots are that you're looking at, the root thickness, because that will all determine whether you can observe these fungi easily inside the root. And also it might be producing strong metabolites that actually interfere with the visualization as well as other species might be growing actually within this root. So there's all these things to consider when trying to study Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal symbiosis. So it is quite difficult and laborious, and this is why science is still searching for answers around what is actually happening with Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in ecosystems. Now, thankfully, there is this beautiful do-it-yourself guide that's been prepared by the Rodale Institute, and it's a guide to on-farm production of Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi inoculum. So you can go to this website at Rodale Institute. I think I've got the link to it in the references. And basically, this is how it works. So first of all, you collect spores and hyphae and colonized root fragments. So you would get that from your natural habitat somewhere on the edge of your farm, for example, where there's a lot of diversity of plants growing. And you would collect this, and of course you probably get someone to look at it under the microscope before you assume they're just there. But let's assume that you have plants that are colonized by Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. What you then do is you transplant these plants from the field into low phosphate potting mix sand or soil. Then you grow the desired seeds or the seedlings in pots with Arbuscular mycorrhizal field plants. So you grow the plant that you transplanted with the plants that you want colonized, with your crop plants basically. Then you check for mycorrhization, so that involves microscopy. And then you transplant that into the field. Once you know that they are colonized, you can put them into the field, and as long as the plant is alive, it will keep the symbiosis going, and you don't have to do much more, because as long as you've got new plants growing that are mycorrhizal with that specific Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, you will get colonization over time. But you can use the leftover roots and soil as inoculum for more plants, so you can just keep harvesting that mycorrhizal abundance and keep inoculating new plants if you want to have a faster effect of colonizing your paddocks with this Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So this is when you're growing a crop or a few crops and you basically just want to propagate this relationship. So it's likely that you'll have some native Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi somewhere on the land, and because they don't really have specific plants that they partner up with, it's likely that these native species will actually colonize your plants as long as those plants are in the family that is likely to be mycorrhizal. So yes, there it is. There's this protocol as to how to do it. So basically, in a nutshell now, I'm just going to end with stressing the importance of this Arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis. The key point is that Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and plant symbiosis is a symbiosis. And you can't study the ecology of either of those organisms in isolation. They've always relied upon one another to feed each other, and so therefore, even though they're two separate species living together, they are living together and they basically as one. The ecological interactions of these organisms can't be looked at in isolation. They're always going to interact with the ecosystem and with each other in this duo. We must include Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi to study plants in natural environments. They are the key drivers of plant communities, and we must consider them in nutrient cycling, nutrient supply, impacts on plant productivity and diversity. They are the primary ecosystem facilitators and can be called keystone mutualists. They are the mediators in plant coexistence, cooperation, and self-maintenance strategies. So it is paramount to understand and preserve this Arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis. And all these factors are absolutely necessary to our understanding and preservation of Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. They are absolutely crucial in conservation of plant communities, really, and in food growth and in food production, fiber production, ecosystem restoration, bush regeneration. So we must consider these organisms in everything plant related. So that concludes lesson 4.6 and actually concludes this entire unit on Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And let me just say that we haven't even uncovered the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more, and there's only so much literature I can read and explain and try to put into this course, but as new research comes out, I'll be adding on new lessons. There's so many questions yet to be answered about this symbiosis, and not just this symbiosis, but also the symbiosis of bacterial symbionts and other organisms that play a crucial role in this symbiosis. So it's not just these two partners, there's so much more that is involved. So anyway, this is our reference list for the unit. So you're more than welcome to dig some of these up and have a read. I've tried my best to synthesize them for you in the lessons in the unit. So I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'll be seeing you in Unit 5, and we'll continue talking about fungi in our next unit. All right, bye for now.